Good morning. I am Elizabeth Allen, and I did my multicultural project on the effect of homelessness in Greenville and an expansion on homelessness's effect on youth. So I was really interested in this because this past summer I did an internship with PMAC, or the Poe Mill Achievement Center in Greenville, which works with a large number of disadvantaged youth, and a lot of those youth are homeless. Um, and so that kind of led me to my first question, because I really wanted to know about the definition of homelessness. Because if you just look up homelessness on the internet, you get that I had to write these down too, so I'm not just coming up with these. But it's the state of having no home, which makes sense. That's the Latin root if you break it down. And I looked it up, and the federal government also uses multiple definitions for homelessness, which I found really odd. But the multiple definitions I found, the first one is living on the street, in a shelter, or bunking with friends and relatives. And usually when working with PMAC, I found that living with friends and relatives is the biggest one that I found. And then when I was looking through my sources, I found three other definitions of homelessness, and none of them match up perfectly. So I found that homelessness can be defined as people without a steady income who cannot support the same residential situation, which makes sense. And then that they used a street outreach program listed in the HMIS database, which is the Homelessness Management Info System. That's kind of specific. And then when I was just looking at youth, can be defined as minors who are on their own who have spent at least one night in emergency shelter or on the streets. I thought that was very interesting that it was minors on their own. So this doesn't include families, but it's just minors who are on their own. And I found something really interesting in that those minors are often referred to as runaways or throwaways. And I had never heard throwaways before, but that's when they're kicked out of their home by their parent, which is so sad, but I had just never heard that word before. So that was my first question of the definition of homelessness and what that really looks like, and it turns out that looks very different for different organizations throughout both the federal government and in people's perceptions. So that was the first very interesting thing that I looked at. And the second thing that I looked after was what are options for people in situations of homelessness, or more, what are like patterns, like what do people do when they're homeless and how do they work to get out of it, because homelessness is never a place that people want to be. So, and I found there's three options that people usually do. So these are the main three things. So the one that most people do is they only experience homelessness once or twice, and they use an emergency shelter for a limited amount of time. And that's the main thing that people do, and that's also the main thing that families do specifically. The next one is that people who are experiencing homelessness have longer stays in transitional housing, which that can be families or individuals. And then the last one is mainly individuals, and they use the system sporadically, moving in and out of homeless programs multiple times during long periods. This is the least stable and usually the most dangerous, and it's usually intermittently interrupted by living out in the open on the streets without any form of coverage. And that's the scariest, that has the most negative impacts on youth especially, but also all ages. And so taking this information from the patterns that I found, I moved into its effect on school-age children. And I found that when youth are in the first option, the first pattern, where you experience once or twice and you use a shelter for at least one night, or at least for a limited amount of time, that has the least negative effects on children. There's still some negative effects, but they are much, much more able to return to normal society and normal independent living. And then it just progressively gets worse the farther down the patterns we go. So the longer stays in transitional housing start to have more negative effects on mental and sometimes physical health. And then the most dangerous, most damaging mentally and physically for our youth is when they use their families or themselves use the system sporadically, moving in and out of homeless programs multiple times during long periods. That has the least amount of stability and the least amount of knowing where you're going to be the next night. And I found that that's usually accompanied by living in a car or moving between these homeless shelters. So it just gets progressively worse the farther down we go. And then I found larger statistics too, so that a large percentage of youth, this is just the youth, so it's back to those minors who are on their own, who spend at least one night in emergency shelters. They have those youth have a larger disproportionate advantage of health problems, emotional problems, behavior problems, and substance abuse. So those four things come up the most when youth are on their own. And then it also, no matter what age you are, it interrupts normal socialization, education, and it affects your possibility to live independently in the future. Which makes sense, but I didn't expect I guess I didn't think about the normal socialization. I thought about education, but I never thought about normal socialization, but that makes sense, that you can't identify with other people in the same way that you would be able to. So it was very eye-opening. And then, so my conclusion after doing all this research is that no matter how long you might be experiencing homelessness, or no matter how intense that experience might be, it is going to have some form of lasting negative effects on specifically your mental health. There's a large correlation between homelessness and mental health problems, and I don't think that's a mistake. I think homelessness creates a fight or flight survival instinct that's very hard to separate later in life. So this was a very eye-opening project, and I know that there's still a lot more that we need to do in order to solve this problem both in Greenville and in America.